"Don't make a sound," the girl whispered, "and don't look at the man by the truck." Gerald Whitmore was 61 years old, had spent 34 of those years building one of the most respected law firms in Halifax, and had never once in his adult life taken direction from a child. But something in the way she said it, flat, certain, with no waver in her voice, made him press himself against the cold brick wall of his own driveway without a single question. He was breathing too loudly. He could hear himself doing it. The girl, who could not have been older than 9 or 10, crouched beside the recycling bins at the corner of the garage. She had a scarf tied over her coat that was slightly too big for her, and mud on the knees of her leggings. She did not look frightened. That was the part Gerald would think about later, long after everything else was over. She did not look frightened was over. She did not look frightened at early. That was the only reason any of it happened the way it did. A Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of day that turns dark by 4 o'clock, and his 2 o'clock client had canceled, and Gerald had thought, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he might just go home, have a cup of tea, sit somewhere quiet. He had pulled up the long gravel drive, parked, and was reaching for his briefcase, when he saw the girl come sprinting from around the side of the house. She had stopped dead when she saw him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she put one finger to her lips and pointed toward the back of the property. Gerald had almost said, "Who are you?" But she was already moving, waving at him to follow. The truck was white. He could see it from where they were crouching, parked along the back fence, half obscured by the stand of spruce trees that lined the property. A man stood beside it with his back turned, talking on a phone. Even from a distance, Gerald could tell the man wasn't a delivery driver. He was standing too still, listening too carefully. "Do you know him?" the girl asked, barely a breath. Gerald did not. He shook his head. "He's been there for 40 minutes, she said. "I counted." Her name was Maeve. She lived 2 properties down with her grandmother. And she had a habit, her grandmother's word, for it was habit, though the woman said it with a kind of affectionate resignation, of cutting through the rear of people's yards on her way home from school. She knew every fence gate, every loose board, every dog that barked and every dog that didn't. She had seen the white truck pull up along the back fence at 2:30. She had watched the man get out and look at the house for a very long time. She had watched him make 2 phone calls, neither of which seemed to go well, because each time he put the phone down, he stood very still with his jaw tight. The way her uncle did when something had gone wrong. She had not left. That was the thing that stayed with Gerald afterward. A 10-year-old girl had watched a strange man stare at a house for 40 minutes and had not left. "Why did you stay?" he asked her later. She thought about it. "Because something felt wrong," she said, "and I didn't want to leave if something felt wrong." Gerald worked in estates and wills. He was not a man who believed in instinct, not professionally. He believed in documentation. He believed in the language of contracts and the precise weight of words on paper. He was not a man who hid behind recycling bins on the basis of a child's feeling. And yet, he took out his phone, careful to hold it low, and photographed the truck. The plates, the man. He sent them to no one yet. He put the phone away and thought. His wife, Catherine, was supposed to be in Montreal, a conference. She had left Sunday morning, rolling her carry-on to the car, while Gerald was still in his dressing gown with his coffee, and she had kissed him on the cheek in that way she had lately, precise, efficient, not quite present, and said she'd be back Thursday. He had not asked much about the conference. He had not asked much about anything lately. That was something he was only beginning to understand. "Has he gone to the door?" Gerald asked the girl. "3 times, Maeve said. "He knocked. Then he called someone. Then he went back to the truck." Gerald looked at the house. The lights were off. He had the only key. The alarm was set. "Did you hear anything he said?" "Some of it." She hesitated in the way children do when they are deciding how much of the truth an adult can handle. He said the thing was supposed to be done before the week was out. And he said the location was a problem. The location. Gerald felt something cold travel the length of his spine. He had met Catherine 11 years ago at a charity dinner for the IWK Health Center. She had been seated 2 places down from him, and had spent most of the evening in conversation with the woman beside her, barely glancing at Gerald until the dessert course, when she had suddenly turned and asked him a question about tax law that was so precise and well-framed that he had laughed out loud before he could stop himself. She was a financial consultant. She was composed. She had dark eyes and a way of entering a room that made other people sit up straighter. They had been married for 9 years. They did not have children. They had, in the last 2 or 3 years, developed a polite and functional distance from each other that neither of them named. Gerald worked long hours. Catherine traveled for work. On weekends, they were cordial and separate, like 2 guests sharing a hotel room. He had told himself this was simply what long marriages became. He had believed it because it was easier than not believing it. The man by the truck made one more call. This time he walked in a small circle as he talked, and Gerald could see his face for a few seconds. Early 50s, wide-set jaw. The kind of physical solidity that suggested he had once done manual labor and had not entirely left it behind. He did not look like someone in the wrong driveway. Maeve was very still beside Gerald. She had her arms wrapped around her knees and she was watching the man the way Gerald had watched witnesses in depositions, without expression, taking everything in. "You should go home," Gerald said quietly. "Are you going to call the police?" He paused. "I'm thinking about it." "Why haven't you yet?" It was an extremely good question. He had been asking himself the same thing for the last 10 minutes. The honest answer was that he was not yet certain what he would tell them. "A man is standing in my backyard" was not technically a crime, and Gerald had spent too many years on the precise edge of what was provable to go forward with nothing. But there was another reason, one he was less willing to look at directly. If he called the police and this turned out to be nothing, a contractor, a mistake, someone with the wrong address, then it ended there. But if it was something else, something that involved Catherine, then the moment he called the police, the situation moved out of his hands entirely. And Gerald, despite everything, was not ready for that yet. "I need to understand what I'm looking at first," he told the girl. She considered this. She did not look convinced, but she nodded. The man left at 4:15. He got back into the truck, made one final call, and drove off along the back service road without hurrying. Gerald waited 5 minutes. Then he stood, brushed the gravel from his trousers, and looked at Maeve. "Thank you," he said. "Genuinely, you didn't have to stay." She shrugged with one shoulder. "Do you know why he was here?" "Not yet. Will you find out?" "Yes," Gerald said, and he meant it the way he had not meant something in a long time, completely, without qualification. "Yes, I will." He went inside. He turned on no lights. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the house, which was quiet in the way houses are when they have been waiting for you. Then he went to his study and began. Gerald Whitmore was a lawyer who specialized in estates. What that meant in practice was that he knew exactly how assets were held, transferred, and, when necessary, moved. He knew what a will looked like when it had been changed recently. He knew what it looked like when it hadn't. He and Catherine had drafted their wills 8 years ago, in the early, easy years of the marriage. He had not looked at his since. He found the file now in the cabinet behind his desk, and he sat down and he read it. His estate, in the event of his death, passed to Catherine entirely. The house, the investments, his share of the firm. The cottage on Cape Breton Island that his father had left him and that Gerald had never been able to bring himself to sell. All of it. He sat with this for a while. Then he opened his laptop. There are things a person can find when they know where to look. Gerald had spent 34 years knowing where to look. He began with Catherine's financial records. Not because he had easy access to them, but because he knew the name of her accountant, and he knew the man had a particular weakness for the kind of wines you could only get from a specific importer in Charlottetown. And Gerald had sent a case of them every Christmas for going on 7 years. He made a phone call. He was careful and oblique, as he always was. He asked questions that sounded like other questions. What he learned, not all at once, but piece by piece over the next 2 days, was that Catherine had, in the past 14 months, moved a significant amount of money into accounts he had not known existed. Not an alarming amount in any single transaction. Careful amounts, patient amounts. The kind of movement that required planning and nerves and a very thorough understanding of how not to be noticed. He also learned that she had, approximately 8 weeks ago, met with a man named Bryce Callender. He was not a financial consultant. He was not in any field that Gerald could connect, through any chain of professional association, to the kind of work Catherine said she did. What Bryce Callender was, as far as Gerald could determine, was a man who solved problems for people who could pay to have problems solved. Gerald had encountered men like this before, at the periphery of certain cases. He knew what they were for. He did not call Catherine. He did not change his routines. He went to work each morning and came home each evening and ate dinner alone in the kitchen. And he was, to anyone who might have been watching, entirely ordinary. Maeve appeared at his back gate on the Thursday. He was in the garden, which he rarely used, raking leaves in the dark for no real reason except that he couldn't stay still. He heard the gate latch and turned. She was standing there in her too big scarf with a thermos in her hands. "My grandmother made soup," she said. "She says you look thin." Gerald set down the rake. "Your grandmother has never seen me. She sees everyone," Maeve said entirely seriously. "She says it's the house that looks thin. She meant you're sad." He didn't answer that. He held the gate open, and she came through, and they sat on the steps of the back porch, and she poured soup into the thermos cap and handed it to him, and Gerald Whitmore, 61 years old, 3 decades a lawyer, drank it. "Have you figured it out?" she asked. "Most of it." "What are you going to do?" He looked out at the yard. The spruce trees along the fence had gone black in the evening. The place where the white truck had parked was just empty ground. "I'm going to make sure I have everything I need," he said. "Before I do anything. Why does it have to be everything?" He thought about how to explain it to a 10-year-old and found that the explanation didn't change much for the audience. Because if you go before you're ready, he said, you can lose, and I can't afford to lose this. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" "Yes," he said. He had not said it out loud before. It felt strange, but not of what you might think. "What then?" He wrapped both hands around the thermos cup. "That I didn't see it sooner, that I was too comfortable, too busy being whatever I was supposed to be to notice what was actually happening in my own house." Maeve pulled her scarf tighter. "My mom didn't notice things for a long time," she said. "And then she did, and then things changed." She paused. "It doesn't mean you were stupid. It means you trusted someone." Gerald looked at her. He thought there were things this child understood that he had not managed to learn in 60 years. "Thank you," he said. "Again. You said that already. It keeps being true." He went to the police on the Friday morning, not to the local station. He knew better than to begin at the bottom of a chain when the situation warranted the top. He went to an inspector he had worked with twice before, a careful, thorough woman named Susan Delacroix, and he sat across from her desk and laid out what he had, methodically, the way he would present evidence in any proceeding. Susan Delacroix listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions. Then she sat back and looked at him for a moment. "You've been sitting on this since Tuesday?" she said. "I needed it to be airtight," Gerald said. She shook her head slowly, not entirely without sympathy. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you could have come to us earlier." "I know," he said, "but then I would have had less." What he had was in fact substantial. Photographs, account transfers, a name, Bryce Callender, which Delacroix's expression confirmed she already knew, though she said nothing to confirm this directly. He also had a recording, entirely legal, taken on his own property, of a phone call that the man by the truck had made on the Tuesday afternoon, which Gerald had captured on his phone from a distance. The audio was imperfect but clear enough in places. Clear enough, at least, to establish that the speaker had been asked to surveil a property and report on the movements of its occupant, and that the person who had asked him to do this had been referred to as the wife. Delacroix looked at the recording on the small screen Gerald held toward her. She did not touch it. "We'll need that," she said. "You'll have it," he said, "along with everything else." Catherine came home from Montreal on Thursday evening, as planned. She let herself in, rolled her carry-on to the bedroom, and came down to find Gerald sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on, and a brief spread across the table in front of him. The picture of himself he had been for 9 years. She kissed him on the cheek. She poured herself a glass of water. She asked how his week had been. "Quiet," he said. "Yours?" "Productive," she said, and went upstairs. He sat at the table for another hour. He thought about the woman he had met at that dinner. Composed, precise, asking a perfectly framed question about tax law and laughing when he answered it. He thought about how long it had been since she had laughed like that. How long it had been since either of them had laughed at all. He did not know, and suspected he would never know for certain when it had changed from distance to something deliberate. He was not sure it mattered. The arrest came on the following Monday, while Gerald was at the office. Susan Delacroix called him at 11:15 in the morning. The call lasted 4 minutes. Gerald sat at his desk afterward and looked out the window at Halifax Harbor, at the gray October water, and the container ships sitting still in the low morning light. And he felt something he could not immediately name. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something quieter than both. The particular stillness of a thing that has been held in tension finally going slack. His assistant knocked and opened the door. "Your 9:30 is here. They've been waiting. Tell them I need 5 minutes," he said. She nodded and closed the door. He sat for 5 more minutes, alone. He thought about a Tuesday afternoon when he had come home early for no real reason, except that he was tired. He thought about a girl with a scarf that was too big for her, sitting beside a recycling bin with her arms around her knees, watching a strange man with no expression and no fear. He thought about what she had said. "It doesn't mean you were stupid. It means you trusted someone." He had turned that sentence over many times in the days since. He was still turning it over. He stopped by Maeve's grandmother's house on the Wednesday afternoon. He had brought a container of maple butter from the shop on Spring Garden Road, which felt inadequate, and then had gone back and added a box of shortbread, which still felt inadequate, but which was what he had. The grandmother, small, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had seen enough of the world to find most of it unsurprising, opened the door, looked at him, looked at the bag he was holding, and said, "I wondered when you'd come. I should have come sooner." he said. Yes, she agreed. She stepped back and held the door open. She's in the kitchen. Maeve was at the table doing homework. She looked up when he came in, assessed the situation, and said, "Did everything work out?" "Yes," Gerald said. "It did." She nodded, satisfied, and looked back at her homework. Good. He set the bag on the counter. He thought about all the things he might say. "Thank you again. I don't know what would have happened. You were extraordinarily brave. Your instincts were better than mine, and found that none of them were quite equal to what was true." What was true was that a child had stayed when she could have left. She had stayed because something felt wrong, and she thought it mattered. She had handed a stranger information that changed the course of events in his life, and she had not made a production of it. She had simply done it, the way you do a thing when the thing is clearly what needs doing. Gerald sat down across from her. He folded his hands on the table the way he did in meetings. "I want to ask you something," he said. She put her pencil down. "When you saw the man by the truck," he said, "and you saw me come home, why did you come to me? You could have gone home. You could have called the police yourself." She thought about it with the same flat seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. "I didn't have enough," she said. "Just a man standing by a fence. That's not enough for the police." She paused. "But it might be enough for the person whose house it is." Gerald looked at her for a moment. "You'd have made a good lawyer," he said. She picked her pencil back up. "I'm going to be a marine biologist," she said. "But thank you." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere before you've decided to do it. He could not remember the last time that had happened. Maeve's grandmother set mugs on the table and poured tea without asking whether anyone wanted it. The kitchen smelled of something baking, and the window above the sink looked out onto the backyard where the last of the season's leaves were coming down, slow and unhurried, in the gray Nova Scotia afternoon. Gerald Whitmore wrapped both hands around the mug. He was 61 years old. His marriage was over. His house was quiet and would be quieter still in the weeks ahead. There was a great deal of difficulty still coming. The legal proceedings, the dissolution of things, the long work of understanding how you live inside a life that turns out to have had a different shape than you thought. But just here, just now in a small kitchen, 2 properties down from his own, with tea he hadn't asked for, and a 10-year-old who had already gone back to her homework, he felt something begin, carefully, to ease. There are people who arrive in your life. There are people who arrive in your life at the exact moment you need them, not because the world is arranged that way, but simply because they were paying attention when others weren't. They are not always who you would have expected. They are not always who you would have chosen. But they are there, and they see what needs to be seen, and sometimes that is the whole of what it takes. Gerald did not say this out loud. He drank his tea. Outside, the leaves kept falling.